Did you see the news? Of course, that's what I'll be leading with tonight. Gary Lineker. I was just about to read something out, but then I decided actually it's probably not for tea time, so I'll move on. Gary Lineker. Lots of you telling me exactly what you think to Gary Lineker. I can't read stuff out if the language is not tea time suitable, just so you know. I do see your comments, hence I was throwing them, but I can't read anything out that's not clean. So keep it clean, and I'll get through to as many of your messages as I possibly can. So Gary Lineker, have you seen everything unfold this week, pretty much? Feels like a lifetime ago now. Long story short, in case you've just switched on, you don't know what on earth's going on. Of course, the small boat crisis is the hot topic for so many people today, and has been for a very long time. But Gary Lineker caused a bit of a storm. He tweeted a few days ago, in response to some of this conversation, that there is no huge influx. I'm quoting directly his tweet here. He says, "We take far fewer refugees than other major European countries. This is just an immeasurably cruel policy directed at the most vulnerable people in language that is not dissimilar to that used by Germany in the 30s. It created quite a big response from loads of people, many of them basically saying that he should be fired from his role on the BBC. And that has divided opinions. Lots of them. He then responded, Gary Lineker then responded with another tweet saying, "Well, it's been an interesting couple of days. Happy that this ridiculously out of proportion story seems to be abating, and I'm very much looking forward to presenting Match of the Day on Saturday. Thanks again for all your incredible support. It has been overwhelming." Well, that was yesterday, by the way. And he was asked outside his house, you know, do you regret your tweets? He says no, he doesn't. But as is the way in life, it moves on, doesn't it? And now the news was broke this afternoon, that he will not be on Match of the Day at all. He's been asked to stand back, and it is really divided opinion, I can tell you. John has said, "Michelle, this is great news, and if anyone wants a stand-in for Saturday, I am available. I will charge £300 and travel expenses from Northampton." It's worth saying as well that Ian Wright, he has said that he will stand down as well this weekend in solidarity with Gary Lineker. David says, "Michelle, you are full of hypocrisy. I am disappointed in you. You are calling for cancel culture, the very thing that you're supposed to be against." I don't know, David, I haven't given my view on it yet. I'm simply explaining the story. But a man that will give me his view is Toby Young, founder of the Free Speech Nation. What do you make to it all?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure it's a free speech issue yet. He hasn't been fired. For what he said in his tweet. He's just been told by the BBC, you can't come back and present Match of the Day until we've agreed what your social media use and what the policy governing it will be in future. So he hasn't yet been punished, or at least not exactly, for what he said. The BBC have simply said, we need to reach an agreement before you come back. Now, there's a further question about, well, what should that agreement be? To what extent should an employer be able to police the speech of one of their employees or one of their contractors outside the workplace? And I think that is a free speech issue. And I think the BBC standard that it wants to impose on Gary Lineker and what he's been accused of breaching, the agreement he's been accused of breaching, is that if he says something or tweets something that brings the BBC into disrepute, then they're entitled to punish him. That's a breach of their social media use policy. But I think that's in some ways too nebulous, too vague a standard. At the Free Speech Union, we've certainly come to the defence of plenty of people who've got into trouble for saying something outside the workplace, often on a private social media channel, like their private Facebook account, which their employer says has brought the employer into disrepute. And we've defended them. We think that is too vague, too low a standard. Employers shouldn't be able to just willy-nilly police what their employees say on the grounds that it might have brought them into disrepute. We think the standard should be, has it caused the employer financial loss? That, I think, is the critical question. And in this case, has what Gary Lineker has said, if he says things like this in future, will it cause the BBC financial loss? And I think maybe. I mean, if people who are right of centre, who disagree with him about Brexit, about mass immigration, if they withhold their BBC licence fee as a consequence, if they conclude the BBC is full of liberal lefties, my views aren't represented, it's not really an impartial organisation, and for that reason I'm not going to pay the licence fee, then I think the BBC could legitimately police what he says if he wants to stray into this sort of really contentious political territory. But I think it's a difficult, nuanced issue.
Yeah, and I think I would agree with what you're saying in terms of if it was a private business, but surely there's a difference here in that this is a very publicly funded organisation that has impartiality apparently at its core. So doesn't that make a difference?
Well, I mean, you could say that about other public sector organisations, about civil servants, about police officers, and, you know, even GBNews, even though it's not a taxpayer-funded news organisation, it still has to abide by various impartiality rules. So would you be happy if GBNews wanted to punish you for saying something in what you felt was a purely personal capacity about a particularly contentious issue? I mean, I think the standard should be that the company, whether it's a public or a private company, if they're going to punish an employee for saying something outside the workplace, it's not enough to be able to show or claim that it's brought the company into disrepute. They have to be able to show financial loss. So I think if the BBC are going to punish Gary for what he said or similar things in future, they need to be able to show that these things are actually causing the BBC financial loss. Not an impossible test to meet, but it'd be interesting to see whether this would meet that test.
Paul Embry?
I think I would instinctively defend people's right to voice an expression, whether it's in the workplace or beyond the workplace, and instinctively would want to come to the defence of Gary Lineker for many of the reasons that Toby says. I do think we need to recognise, though, that this case is not quite so clear-cut as a case as any other normal case in the workplace, because, as you alluded to, Michelle, the truth is that the BBC is the national broadcaster and it is required by charter to uphold impartiality. And I think that there's an argument to say that if you are employed by the BBC or contracted by the BBC, particularly in the area of news and current affairs, I think there's a legitimate argument to say, look, we can't have people in news and current affairs going out off-piste and declaring particular views on certain contentious, topical political issues. I think there's an argument probably to say that in terms of news and current affairs, and possibly a bit more widely in terms of people who could reasonably be seen as significant figures within the BBC, even if they're not necessarily in news and current affairs. So people who might be seen as, you know, in some way ambassadors for the BBC, representatives of the BBC. I think Lineker probably falls into that category. OK, his domain is sport. He's a TV presenter, match of the day. But nonetheless, when people look at him, when people listen to him, they do understand that there's a real strong BBC thread running through him. So I think there's an argument for extending it arguably to people like him. I think the difficulty really is that I think the BBC have acted because they do face these accusations regularly. Not without justification, that they are a very kind of left-leaning, certainly culturally liberal institution. I mean, this was something Andrew Marr said in an interview a few years ago. I mean, he's pretty much a man who's on the liberal left, but he said, look, there's no doubting the BBC is a culturally liberal institution which doesn't speak for large parts of Britain. And I guess the BBC are now thinking, look, that has stuck, that accusation has stuck. And if we don't do something about Lineker, then arguably it's just going to reinforce that idea in people's minds. I don't think, to be honest, Lineker helped himself particularly, because when he came out of his house the next day, he was very dismissive, actually, of the controversy and said, well, of course I stand by what I said, of course I'm not worried about suspension. And I think that probably upped the stakes to a certain degree.
He was a bit cocky, wasn't it? And
forced the BBC's hand.
And in case you've not seen any of the print media today, I mean, look, the pressure was on. Let me just hold that. Can you see it? So this is the front page of the Mail. Lineker's playing the BBC for fools. That's the Mail today. You've got the Express. Suella blasts Lineker. Now, will the BBC make him say sorry? Don't know if you can see that. So the pressure has been on from various different camps. You guys are getting in touch. lots of you are saying, you know, you're quite happy at this news because then you will be able to now go on and watch the match of the day this weekend. Are you telling me that you didn't used to watch it previously because he was on?
Bring back Des Lynam and Alan Hansen, that's what I say.
Yeah, well, lots of people are offering up their services, I've got to say. Where are the objections to his mark, right of centre? Why are there objections to his mark? Yeah, did one of you say that his anyone criticising or pushing back must be right of centre? Are they aiming that at you? I don't know who he's aiming at. One of us has said that, apparently. I don't know who it is. Lots of celebration here. Lots of people asking as well about, is there some form of bias here? Because my old boss, Alan Sugar, people say, well, he's a BBC presenter, but he's made various comments. I remember a comment that he made, he got into a bit of criticism for, where he had a black football team and then the black sellers, you know, the sellers of the, what I would say, fake stuff on the beaches. And he compared the two, but he wasn't fired for that. So people are saying, is there a double standard, a hypocrisy?
Well, Gary Lineker hasn't been fired yet, either. But he is getting, at the very least, a wrist slap, and maybe that's what Alan Sugar got, so maybe there's not a double standard there. But I agree with the point Paul made. One of the reasons this is such a live wire for the BBC is because whenever, well, for the most part, 75% of the time, if not more, when a BBC presenter, someone who is the face of the BBC, says something on social media, enters the political fray, they come at it from the left. And that creates the impression that the BBC has a bias to the left. And the reason, which I think is broadly true, I mean, if there were more right-of-centre people associated with the BBC taking the other side in the immigration debate, for instance, if they were tweeting alongside Gary Lineker saying this, then what Gary Lineker has said wouldn't pose such a threat to the BBC. It would just be part of the broad church of opinion within the state broadcaster. But because so much of this stuff, whenever it kind of comes out on Twitter or on other social media platforms, is expressing a left-of-centre point of view, and that's the point of view that people associate with the BBC, that's why it's difficult for the BBC who want to preserve their reputation for impartiality.
And I think the whole debate around Brexit, Toby, threw that into sharp relief to a certain degree, because I certainly got the impression from the BBC that inherently they always regarded Brexit as something that was really illegitimate. OK, it's happened, but, you know, we at the BBC know it shouldn't really have happened. And one of the interesting stats was in terms of the question time panel over recent years since Brexit. Now, considering that 52% of the country voted for Brexit, only a minority and a distinct minority of panellists in the years that followed on Question Time, which is, of course, the BBC's flagship political debate programme, were people who openly supported Brexit. OK, that's sort of produced by an external production company, but nonetheless it goes out on the BBC. And I just think there's this kind of sense among people that the BBC is very much a kind of inside the M25 organisation, very much, and those of us, and I'm sure we all have at various points, who have sort of walked the corridors of Television Centre, will know exactly the sort of people that we're talking about, all very nice, but all quite middle class, all kind of graduates, mainly sort of London, some of them are in Salford now, and all have a kind of progressive, let's call it, liberal worldview. And however much they might argue that that doesn't filter through, the truth is that in terms of the output, it does. And I think that people out there in provincial Britain and small-town Britain see that every day through the BBC. And I'm a BBC man, by the way. I like the BBC and support the BBC. And I'm on the left, but nonetheless, it's impossible to argue against the proposition that it is a left-leaning organisation. It plainly is.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, I've done lots and lots of BBC current affairs, debate programmes and all the rest of it. And I've always felt that I've always been like the kind of the token Brexiteer. So there's me with a panel of Remainers, or there's me kind of saying that, I don't know, you should control your borders among a group of people saying absolutely not, that's kind of racist and all the rest of it. So yeah, I've always felt, whenever I've done the BBC, that my perspective was definitely the minority perspective among the show. What do you think to the criticism of the BBC? Do you feel it is perhaps biased towards the left? Do you think that's fair? Your thoughts on Gary Lineker? I want them coming in as well. I've got these guys on Lineker Watch on Twitter to see whether or not he tweets anything, because Gary Lineker's blocked me, unfortunately.
I think he's kind of living his life backwards, Gary Lineker, because when I was a kid sort of growing up and I was quite obsessed about football, he was always this very straight-laced, non-political, very respectable, kind of straight-down-the-line kind of guy who never got involved in anything contentious. But the older he's got, the more he's kind of become radical. I mean, I'm half expecting him to join the Socialist Workers' Party and have a green Mohican the next time he pops up on television. It's quite odd. And, OK, you know, he's entitled to his opinions, of course he is, but I do think there needs to be a debate about to what extent, because you don't want an oversteer where, I said to you before we came on air, Michelle, where some young production assistant working on Songs of Praise is told you cannot voice any political opinion about any issue whatsoever on social media. That would be ridiculous. But I do think when it comes, as I said, to news and current affairs and to significant other figures within the BBC, perhaps the rules, because of the charter requirement in terms of impartiality, should be a bit different.
Debbie, one of my viewers, raises an interesting point. She says, Michelle, none of this is anything to do with politics. It's all about his abhorrent comparison to the Holocaust. It's despicable. He is an arrogant, obnoxious individual, says Debbie. I think you make an interesting point there about the actual, the content of the message, the comparison. Was that something that offended you? I think, Debbie, I get the vibe there from you that yes, it did.